every day during this period, they'd bring a measure of the barley offering, because it was the season for harvesting barley. They'd bring like a handful of barley to offer at the temple. And so that's how it got to be called the Feast of Weeks. So let's take a look now at our outline. That's what we're going to be talking about today. Shavuot. So it's not actually, it's the only holiday in the Bible that doesn't give a date. It doesn't say on the 15th day of the month like it does for other holidays, or on the first day of the week, or the 7th day of the week. It says you're going to count 50 days, and that's when the holiday falls. It doesn't tell you what day of the month, what month or what day of the month it is. But by the way, that led leads some scholars to believe that it was a flexible day. So it tells you to count 50 days, but it doesn't exactly tell you when to start counting. It says to start counting from the Shabbat of Passover. And so that might be whenever Shabbat falls in the middle of those 7 days of Passover, that's when you start the counting. But tradition said, no, there, when it says Shabbat, it means the first day of the festival, which is, as we know, festivals are like Shabbat. You're not supposed to do work on them. And so it really was talking about the first day of Passover. So you start counting on the second day of Passover. The second day is the first day of Shavuot, of the counting. And then you count 50 days. That means that it does have a fixed day in the calendar. And so, so it always is going to come out on the 6th and 7th of the month of Sivan. So Passover falls during the month of Nisan in the Jewish calendar. Then comes the month of Iyar, which is going to be starting this Saturday is the first of, this coming Saturday is the first day of the month of Iyar. And after Iyar comes the month of Sivan. And on the 6th day of Sivan is when Shavuot falls. That's 50 days. This holiday is sometimes also called Atzeret. It comes from the Hebrew word atzor, which means to conclude or to end, to stop. And it's the concluding festival of the spring holiday cycle. The spring holiday cycle begins with Shavuot, with Passover, and it ends with Shavuot. The fall holiday cycle, as we said way back at the beginning of this class in September, the fall holiday cycle begins with Rosh Hashanah, the new year. Then we have Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And then we have the 7 days of Sukkot, the Feast of Booths. And then we also have a holiday sometimes called Atzeret, Shmini Atzeret, the 8th day of assembly, the 8th day that concludes the fall holiday cycle. So there's a fall holiday cycle and then a spring holiday cycle in the Jewish calendar. And Shavuot concludes the spring holiday cycle, so it's sometimes called Atzeret. It also gets the name in rabbinic literature of Zman Matan Toratenu. The Zman means time, Matan, it means giving, and Torah, right, the Torah, so Toratenu is our Torah. It's the time of the giving of our Torah. That is to say, the time of the revelation at Mount Sinai when we got the 10 Commandments. How did they figure that out? Well, the rabbis looked at Exodus chapter 19, verse 1, where it says that the Israelites arrived at Mount Sinai on the first day of the 3rd month. The 3rd month, as I just said, was Sivan, right? The first month is Nisan. The 2nd month is Iyar, which is going to start this Saturday. And the 3rd month is Sivan. So at the first day of the month of Sivan, they arrived at Mount Sinai. And now we only have to work out how we get 6 more days, and then the giving of the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai would fall on Shavuot. So that part of the story is not so clear. It's not, you can't just read the text and it says, oh, on the 6th day they got the 10 Commandments. The rabbis kind of fudged. They read certain phrases in those early verses of chapter 19 that's saying, oh, this was day 1, that's day 2, that's day 3. Because they wanted to get to the idea that Shavuot commemorates this historical event. All the holidays in the Torah were both agricultural festivals and then we added a historical symbolism to each of them as well. They originally were agricultural festivals because our people were originally farmers. So as I said, there's a set of fall holidays and a set of spring holidays. Why is that? Because those are the two times when farmers are doing harvests. So the holidays fall around the fall harvest festival and around the spring harvest festival. In Passover's case, it's the wheat harvest first, and then the barley harvest first, and then the wheat harvest. Also, the first fruits that come from trees. But there are certain fruits that also ripen in the fall, and the fall harvest cycle is represented by Sukkot. So they have this agricultural aspect, but then historical context. Passover is the obvious one. It obviously commemorates the Exodus from Egypt. Sukkot, because we sit in booths, we say it reminds us of the temporary dwellings that we used while we wandered for 40 years in the desert of Sinai. So it doesn't represent a particular time in the calendar, but a 40-year part of our history where we were wanderers. And so we live in temporary dwellings outside. And Shavuot, the rabbis wanted to link to the revelation at Sinai, which is the other major historical event in Jewish history. And so with a little bit of fudging, and not inappropriately in my opinion, they worked it out that the 6th day of Sivan is in fact the day of the giving of the Ten Commandments. Those two events, the Exodus from Egypt, recognizing that we were slaves in Egypt and God set us free, and number two, that God gave us a revelation of the Ten Commandments and later the Torah as a way of life, those two events are like the primary historical seminal moments of establishing Israelite and then later Jewish culture, religion, tradition. And so it's not a surprise that we want to commemorate those with two important holidays. So we have Passover and Shavuot. Zman Matan Toratenu. So particularly it was the Torah. You sometimes hear Jews confusing these things. We say it represents the giving of the Torah, but really the Torah is at least the 5 books of Moses. Sometimes we use Torah just to mean teaching, and it can mean anything in Jewish tradition, but at least it means the 5 books of Moses. And the Ten Commandments, as we know, is only one part of one chapter of one book in the Exodus. So specifically what's given at Mount Sinai is the Ten Commandments. Some traditions want to teach that the entire Torah was given at Mount Sinai, but even in the book of Numbers, it already says they left Mount Sinai and they continued on the road, and the rest of Numbers and Deuteronomy clearly doesn't happen at Mount Sinai. The idea of trying to put the entire 5 books of Moses at Mount Sinai is a rabbinic idea to say the whole Torah has the significance as if we heard the whole thing from God directly at Sinai. But it's clearly not historically true. And so what at least according to the Torah, is historically accurate is that the Ten Commandments were given at Mount Sinai, and that specifically is what the Shavuot holiday represents. Okay, so we're getting the Ten Commandments at Mount Sinai. I'm going to give you a midrash a little bit later. We talked about how Exodus 19 determines that it's happened on the 6th of Sivan. If you want to look at the Talmud, it's a little complicated, but it's on page 86b. Although we commemorate the giving of the Ten Commandments at Sinai once a year on Shavuot, we also commemorate the giving of the Ten Commandments every single week with the Torah service, particularly on Shabbat, with the majesty and procession that we do on Shabbat morning, where we have a song, there's special verses, we open the ark, we take the Torah out, we parade it around the congregation, and we read it in a liturgical way. The Torah service was constructed by the rabbis as a way to remember the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. And so we remember the Sinai event every week because it is such an important event in Jewish history. Just like we remember the Exodus from Egypt every single day when we sing Mi Chamocha Ba'elim Adonai, who is like you, God among the mighty. That was from the song our ancestors sang at the Red Sea after they crossed safely to the other side. And we sing that twice every day in the prayers. So we have Passover to remember the Exodus, especially on once a year, but every day we remember the Exodus from Egypt in our prayers. And in the same way, we have a special day to recognize the giving of the Ten Commandments at Sinai on Shavuot. But every week, we remember that with the Torah service. So because it was such an important event. So therefore, the idea of counting the days between Passover and Shavuot, the rabbi said, why does the Torah want us to count the days? It doesn't ask us to count the days between, say, Rosh Hashanah and Simchat Torah or Shmini Atzeret at the end of the fall holiday cycle. Why are we supposed to count the days between Passover and Shavuot? There must be something that God's trying to tell us. And the obvious answer to that question is that freedom, the freedom from slavery that Passover represents, is not complete without obligation and responsibilities. This is like, I'm a big fan of Marvel Comics, so pardon me. It's kind of like Spider-Man's uncle who says, with great power comes great responsibility, right? Freedom is a tremendous power. Human beings have this amazing free will that we don't believe other animals have, that we can actually choose what we want to eat for breakfast, how we want to behave with other people. We can choose. We're not pre-programmed how we live our lives. We actually have a choice every single day, every single minute to decide what we want to do, how we want to use our lives, how we want to use the precious moments that we have on earth. That's an amazing power. But with that great power comes great responsibility. And the way we're supposed to channel that power, we believe, is through the Torah. And so what it is the rabbi said, is that Passover and Shavuot represent two different poles, two different aspects of what it means to be a fulfilled human being, and especially what it means to be a fulfilled Jew. That is, it's not enough to be free. You have to be free to use your freedom responsibly, to be obliged to do God's will, to make this world a better place. We have been charged with a mission. We believe all of humanity is charged with the mission to care for the planet that God gave us and to care for each other. And Jews in particular are supposed to try and be examples of that by following the commandments, most of which are ethical commandments. And as I've said before, the ritual commandments are designed either to remind us of these ethical responsibilities or to remind us that we are creatures of God and we have a relationship with God, and to remind us that we have responsibilities towards other Jews in particular to build a strong and nurturing community, a faithful, just, honest, fair, and also compassionate, kind, and caring community amongst ourselves as Jews. The rituals so do that. They bind us together as a community, and they help us develop a relationship with God, and then they remind us of our responsibilities as human beings to God's planet. So the ritual rules and the ethical rules are these responsibilities that God gave us to channel our freedom in positive directions. And that's why really this time period is really so important, and unfortunately not always recognized by Jews as being so important. It's because it represents these two pillars of Jewish thinking: freedom and responsibility. And finally, Shavuot is sometimes also called Chag HaBikurim. Bikurim means first fruits. So Chag is festival. So it's the festival of first fruits. By the way, just as an aside here, and for no particular reason, you may know that when Muslims make their religious trip to Mecca, they call it the Hajj, right? So Arabic and Hebrew are related languages, And for most of the Arabic speaking world, the G, there isn't a hard G sound, but the G is the soft G sound. So they pronounce it Hajj, but you can see that it's actually a cognate, the related word in Hebrew, Chag, because Chag also means a pilgrimage festival. Of course, our pilgrimage is not to Mecca, as the Muslims do. Our pilgrimage would have been to Jerusalem, the center of our tradition. So the three pilgrimage festivals of Sukkot, the Feast of Booths, Passover, the Feast of Freedom, and Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, are Chagim, right? So they're Chagim. So Chag HaBikurim means the festival of first fruits. So there are 5 species of fruit that are specifically mentioned in the Torah that are found in the land of Israel. The verse is down here, Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 8. Deuteronomy 8:8 actually lists 7 species of produce in Israel, but 2 of them are wheat and barley, so they are grains. So there's 2 grains and then 5 fruits that are mentioned in Deuteronomy as special to Israel: grapes, figs, pomegranates, olives, and dates. And so these first fruits would have been brought to the temple during Chag HaBikurim on Shavuot. And they would also bring loaves of bread from the first wheat harvest, which is why it also is called Chag HaKatzir. Katzir means harvest. So the festival of harvest. It's the end of the barley harvest. We finished counting our 50 days of barley, and now we begin the wheat harvest. Okay, so that's kind of a basic idea of the festival of Shavuot. What do we do on Shavuot? So sadly, many people comment there was no fixed ritual, no ritual way of making the holiday special. You know, Rosh Hashanah is the new year. We were supposed to blow the shofar. At least that is in the Torah. And so we blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. That's a special thing we do on Rosh Hashanah. Yom Kippur, we fast and we pray and we ask God's repentance. Sukkot is the Feast of Booths. So we build a booth in our backyard and we dwell in it and we eat in it. And we're supposed to take the palm and the willow and the myrtle and the etrog, the citron, and we shake them together and we parade around the synagogue shaking these different plants to celebrate the harvest festival. So we have rituals. Passover is full of rituals. We have a whole Seder meal the first night. We're only eating matzah for a whole week. We don't eat bread. There's all these special rituals. We have to clean our house. We're only eating kosher for Passover food. It's a very special holiday. Shavuot. Bible doesn't really tell us anything. First fruits. Well, you don't have a temple, so we're not bringing first fruits. It's like nothing to do on the holiday that's special. It's a holiday. It's like Shabbat. You're not supposed to work. You have a special Torah reading, but no ritual. Poor Shavuot. That is probably why many people believe a lot of Jews today who are not so religious kind of tend to forget about Shavuot because there was no ritual that marked its specialness. And that's tragic, right? Because it's about the giving of the 10 Commandments. What could be more important than that? And yet it's often overlooked because there's no ritual, which, if nothing else, tells us the importance of rituals and the importance of rituals in marking our lives and adding significance to time, right? There's no ritual, Shavuot seems to get lost. But over time, there were some rituals, and they're not universal because they're very late. They come in the Middle Ages, most of them. And so they're not necessarily universally observed. One of them was to eat dairy foods. And I have a link here so you can follow the link to an article that talks about it. We're not sure at all why the custom of eating dairy foods on the night of Shavuot came up. And a lot of different reasons are given. And modern scholars will tell you that when there are a lot of reasons given for a custom and we don't know the origin, it's because we really don't know why it started. So we made up reasons after the fact. After people were already doing it for many generations, They said, why do we do this? And they came up with different reasons. We don't know why, but there is a custom of eating dairy foods. In Ashkenazic countries, that meant blintzes, which are kind of crepes filled with cheese. But other people would eat other dairy food, cheesecake or other things. At Beth Yeshurun, we typically have ice cream in the evening for our dairy food. So dairy foods was one custom that developed. The mystics in Sfat, the mystics who were in the 1500s, 1600s living in Sfat, developed this idea called a tikkun leil Shavuot. So again, these mystics believed that the Messiah was around the corner. They had been expelled from Spain, which was supposed to be the traumatic cataclysm that would precede the coming of the Messianic era. And right after they're expelled from Spain, the Ottoman Empire welcomes them into Turkey, which was miraculous. And the Ottoman Empire then conquers the part of Asia where Israel is. So it captures Palestine or Israel and has control over that territory. And the Sultan of Turkey allows the Jews to settle in Israel. And he then rebuilds the walls of the old city of Jerusalem. All of these things indicated to these Jews in Sfat that the Messiah must be around the corner. Surely God's redemption is coming soon. And in their thinking, they said, we believe we can help to make this happen, but not by taking up weapons of war and going to battle, but by doing spiritual religious things. And their particular brand of mysticism, they felt that at the time of creation, some tragedy happened that shattered God's holy sparks of holiness in the world, and we need to fix it somehow. And every time we fix something, we make it more possible for the world to be improved so that the Messiah will come. So for Shavuot, if you're following this so far, and I'm not an expert in Kabbalah, I'm just explaining what their thinking was. For Shavuot, they said the Jews themselves did something really stupid the night before they got the Ten Commandments. What was the stupid thing they did? They fell asleep. Fancy that. They fell asleep at night. Why was that so tragic? What's the big deal? Everybody falls asleep at night. That's natural. But these mystics in Sfat said, no, this was the night before the great wedding. For them, the wedding of the Israelite people with God, the marriage of God to Israel, was going to happen in the morning with the giving of the Ten Commandments. I mentioned before in the class that you can see the holidays as sort of symbolic of elements of a marriage relationship. Passover, when God took us out of slavery in Egypt, was like the betrothal. God took us out of Egypt to betroth us to himself, right? Took us out of the house of bondage, out of sort of like a bride being taken away from her home and then becoming married to the groom. God is the groom. So his taking us out is the betrothal aspect. And then we're getting ready for the marriage. When does the marriage happen? At Mount Sinai. And in a Jewish marriage, there has to be a wedding contract, the ketubah. And what is the ketubah? The Ten Commandments. So for these rabbis, the marriage ceremony of Israel and God happens at Mount Sinai with the Ten Commandments. And that's the wedding day. Well, and by the way, Sukkot represents sort of the either the honeymoon afterwards, or if you like, the in between the in between time between the betrothal and the wedding. Either way, it's however you want to look at it. So, but if Shavuot represents the wedding day, what bride, the rabbis said, can fall asleep the night before the wedding? She's too excited. She's so anxious and anxiously anticipating the beautiful day when the marriage is going to happen, and yet the Israelites fell asleep like they didn't care. Terrible, terrible, terrible. So the mystics in Sfat said, what we need to do is we need to fix that mistake, because if we can fix that mistake, among the other things we're going to fix, the Messiah will come. So how do we fix the mistake our ancestors make by falling asleep before the giving of the Ten Commandments? We are going to stay up all night learning Torah. We're going to prepare ourselves for the great wedding by studying God's words, studying Torah all night. And they called that the tikkun, the repair of Leil Shavuot, the night of Shavuot. And they actually developed actual texts where they put together the first chapter of each of the books of the Torah, or the first verses and last verses of each Torah portion, and then certain selections from Mishnah and Talmud and Midrash and a whole collection of things. And they created these books, which they actually would read during the course of the night. And that was what they did. This idea of having a tikkun leil Shavuot became a sort of reinvigorated amongst non-mystic Jews, including us, quite all over the world. And so Beth Yeshurun has had every year, we're still trying to decide what we're going to do this year, but every night of Shavuot, we have our own little Tikkun Leil Shavuot where we study something. But we don't do the way the mystics did it, because we feel that's too rote, too mechanical. They would actually read these books they constructed. We feel it's more meaningful to take some passages of Torah or some concepts or ideas in Jewish tradition or thought and to study and learn those, to actually get something spiritual and significant for the evening. So we will put together a program of 3 or 4 hours of study. We don't go all night, which is the tradition. You start studying from nightfall until the early dawn, and then you do the morning service, and when you read the Torah service, you read the part about giving the Ten Commandments at Sinai. But we don't stay up all night. We only go to about midnight. Traditionally, we ended our Torah study, as I said, with ice cream for the dairy aspect. We probably won't be gathering together this year. If we do, we have something planned. But if we don't gather, we have to do plan B. And probably what we'll do is each of the rabbis will do some kind of presentation on a Zoom conference. And people can join the Zoom conference, kind of like we did the Zoom Seder. So we'll have studying for a few hours and then sign off. United Orthodox Synagogues, which is around the corner from us, used to go all night. By the way, the tradition was to have dairy in the early evening, but then later at night, UOS would have barbecue meat. So for people who like meat, they would have that later. And in the morning, they would still be up and they'd read the Torah service the way the traditional mystics used to do it. But now it's even more than just mystics. Many Jewish congregations do some kind of a Tikkun Leil Shavuot. Even Reform synagogues will do some kind of Tikkun Leil Shavuot. It's an opportunity to do some learning, to give it's a way to give a ritual to this important holiday, which is about giving the Torah. So what better way to celebrate giving the Torah than to study some kind of wisdom, Jewish wisdom together. So Tikkun Leil Shavuot became sort of the new ritual that we do to observe Shavuot. So that's the Tikkun Leil Shavuot. Oh, I forgot to mention one other thing about that. A few years ago, there was an article published in a Jewish journal which said, the idea that these mystics in Sfat had of staying up all night was not entirely coincidental. This happened around the 1500s. And around that time, coffee was discovered in Europe and in Asia. Coffee originally came from Africa, but in the Ottoman Empire, it started being imported into Turkey, and then from the Ottoman Empire into Asia. And of course into Europe as well. Through different trade routes, it got into Europe. And all of a sudden, people are drinking coffee. And coffee, of course, has the magic elixir of caffeine, which I celebrated this morning myself. Many of us probably did. And it actually was mentioned in one of these mystic texts in Sfat that, we want to stay up all night. And isn't it wonderful that there's this new magical elixir we can use that will help us to stay up all night and celebrate the holiday? So there is a historical influence of coffee on the idea of having a Tikkun Leil Shavuot. And that is still done by many people today, having coffee so we can stay up. So, as with all of the special holidays, there's a short book from the Bible that we read. On Passover, we read the Song of Songs, which is racy love poetry, because, as I mentioned before, Passover is the betrothal of the Israelites to God. And the rabbi said, get your minds out of the gutter. This is not racy love poetry. This is all metaphorical for the relationship of Israel to God. It's all about our romance with God. And so Song of Songs was read for Passover. And on Shavuot, we read the book of Ruth. Why do we read the book of Ruth? So it's actually because Ruth, and this is important for our class, is considered to be the biblical archetype for a choosing Jew. That is, someone who's chosen to join the Jewish people. And it's really a very beautiful story. I recommend reading it. Actually, I'm doing a new Lunch and Learn series that starts this Wednesday, where I'm going to look at some of these books. And this Wednesday, I'll be looking at the book of Ruth particularly, so you can log in around noontime to hear my talk about the book of Ruth, so I won't go into detail about it now. But it's a beautiful love story. Starts out with tragedy in the first few verses, but then plays out as a beautiful love story. And it's about the main characters showing tremendous, tremendous loving kindness and compassion for others, including Ruth, the biblical archetype for the choosing Jew. Maybe I'll just say a little bit about it. So the opening of the book is a tragedy. An Israelite couple leave Israel and they travel across the Jordan River into Moab on the east. And the Bible says the Israelites are not allowed to marry Moabite women. They're not allowed to, it's forbidden. But this family has two boys, and the two boys each marry Moabite women. And then the tragedy strikes, and the father is killed, the father dies, and the two sons die. And all that's left are the three women, the mother and the two daughters-in-law. And all of that happens in the first few verses of the book of Ruth. So Naomi, the mother, is utterly grief-stricken. She is inconsolable, naturally. Within a matter of a short time, her husband dies and her two children die, and she feels like there's nothing left for her in the world. She is completely bereft and miserable and depressed, horribly depressed. So she turns to her two daughters-in-law and she says, look, there's nothing here for me anymore. I'm going to go home. I heard the famine is over in Israel, and so I'm going to return back to my relatives, and hopefully somebody will support me there and I'll find some way to live. And the two daughters-in-law, the two Moabite women, say, no, we'll come with you. And so Naomi then tries to dissuade them from coming. And one of the two of them says, okay, you're right. Naomi said, you're going to be strangers in a strange land. You don't know anybody there. Who's going to marry you? In those days, it was very important for women to be married. In particular, was economically and safety-wise, it was better to be married. But she said, no, who would you find to marry you? You have your kinsman here, you'll get married again, you can live a full life. You have your whole life ahead of you. And so one of the daughters is dissuaded and she stays, but the other one, Ruth, says, no, I'm going to follow you. And Naomi tries to dissuade her a second and a third time. And after the third time of trying to tell her to stay, Ruth makes the famous statement, don't urge me to turn away from following you, for wherever you go, I will go. And wherever, and your people will be my people, and your God my God, and where you die will I die, and there I will be buried. I vowed before God that nothing but death could part me from you. Very moving compassionate statement, which is understood in the tradition not just to be a statement of commitment to the Jewish people, which it is, and to the Jewish God, which it is, but also a commitment to Naomi, who she sees as, this horribly depressed, bereft woman who is maybe suicidal and doesn't seem to have anything left in her life. And Ruth, at least one way of looking at it is, feels like she needs to protect this woman and take care of her to make sure she's going to be okay. And so it's out of her tremendous compassion for Naomi, partly, that she decides, I can't leave this woman. But we also believe she really wanted to be committed to the Jewish people and the Jewish faith and Jewish way of life. And so she follows Naomi back home. And then, so there's, on the one hand, compassion of Ruth, the deep compassion and sympathy and commitment that Ruth has. And then when they arrive back home again, there's an Israelite character named Boaz who demonstrates his compassion and kindness towards Ruth and Naomi. He is apparently a relatively well-off landowner with a lot of property and a lot of crops and wealth. And he makes sure that they are very well taken care of. And I don't want to give away the ending, but they all live happily ever after. So you can read the story. It's great. Or you can listen to my talk on Wednesday. So that's the book of Ruth. But the book of Ruth is used, again, as the story of the archetype person who chooses to be Jewish. She says, your people will be my people and your God, my God, which emphasizes the two aspects of conversion to Judaism. It's about adopting a religious way of life and a religious approach to God. Your God will be my God. But it's also about choosing to join a people. Your people will be my people. And I'm going to sort of follow the rules and customs and traditions of your people. And I will sort of be an immigrant. Again, I like to analogize it to American society. I'm going to become a naturalized citizen of your people. I'm going to learn what I need to learn to feel comfortable in your world, and then I'm going to be a full-fledged member and have all the responsibilities and also the privileges of being part of your community. Your people will be my people. So we read the book of Ruth on Shavuot, and that's why I believe also Shavuot is a wonderful holiday for people who have chosen to be Jewish. Now there is a gematria. Here I mentioned the word gematria. That is a Hebrew word that comes from Greek. Again, there's sort of the hard G and the soft G. So if you gematria, it also almost sounds like geometry, and that's the Greek word it comes from. So it's a mathematical fun game that Jews play. Gematria is the tradition of taking the Hebrew alphabet and counting each Hebrew letter as also having a number value. So Aleph is 1, Bet is 2, Gimel is 3, Dalet is 4, etc. Yud is 10, Kaf is 20, Lamed is 30, Mem is 40, etc. So you get to Kuf, which is 100, Resh is 200, Shin is 300, and Taf is 400. And then based on these number values, rabbis play all kinds of games. So if you take Ruth's name, Resh, Vav, Taf, and you add up the number value, Resh, as I said, was 200, Vav is 6, and Taf is 400. So 200, 6, 400 is 606. Now, as you probably, hopefully know by now, the Jewish tradition says we have 613 commandments. 606 is almost 613. So the number game continues. We're missing 7 commandments. Where are those 7 commandments that are missing? So the Jewish tradition also has this idea that God gave Noah 7 commandments. They're the 7 commandments of Noah. You can Google that if you like to, the 7 commandments of Noah. The idea is that Noah is the new Adam after the flood. So Noah is now the father of all of humanity. And therefore, God has given all of humanity 7 commandments. What are those commandments? to have a judicial system, not to murder, not to steal, not to commit adultery, sort of the 7 basic laws of having a civilized society. And the rabbis have found clever ways to tease out of the text when Noah gets off the boat, when God talks to Noah, how to tease out of that text these 7 commandments. So Noah, in other words, all of humanity is commanded with 7 commandments. The Jews got an extra 606. And so the gematria is that Ruth, in her name, has this idea that she was destined to be joined the Jewish people because her name means 606, the extra 606 commandments she was going to take on when she became Jewish. That's kind of the gematria there. So it's kind of clever. And so that's about the book of Ruth. It is a festival like the other 2, Sukkot and Passover, and therefore it's a semi-Shabbat. No work is supposed to be done. There are some minor exceptions, which we've talked about in past classes, so that you can, mostly so that you can cook food and have hot food during the Passover holiday. So just a few other things I want to point out before we quit. One of them is that one of my favorite midrashim, my favorite rabbinic commentaries on the giving of the 10 Commandments. And it's based on the verse in the Bible that says, I am the Lord, the opening verse of the 10 Commandments. I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt. And in Hebrew, I am the Lord your God is Anochi Adonai Elohecha. Right? Ani, I am Adonai, the Lord, Elohecha, your God. But it's not in the plural. Elohecha is singular. And so the rabbis asked, why is God, who's talking to, according to the Bible, 600,000 men over the age of 20, plus women and children, so maybe 2 million people. I know it's a fantastical number, but clearly there's a huge multitude of people standing at Mount Sinai. Why does God say to all of these people gathered together, I am your God in the singular? Why doesn't he say, I am y'all's God, as we might say in Texan? I am y'all's God. He says, no, I am your God, like he's pointing to only one person. So the commentary is, Rabbi Levi said, the Holy One appeared to Israel at Sinai as though he were a statue with faces on every side, so that 1,000 people might be looking at the statue, but they would be led to believe it was looking directly at each one of them individually. So too, when the Holy One spoke, each and every person in Israel could say, the divine word is addressing me specially. I'm getting addressed. Not everybody here, or everybody each individually, but me particularly. And it says, note the scripture doesn't say, I am y'all's God, but I am the Lord, your God, singular. Moreover, Rabbi Yossi ben Hanani says, the divine word spoke to each person according to his particular capacity. And I just think this is a phenomenal statement of the rabbis 2,000 years ago, talking about how God communicates with human beings. And basically saying, you know, each person has their own intellectual abilities or disabilities. Everybody has their own capacity to understand in their own particular way. We each have our own particular interests. Some people like art, some people like poetry, some people like literature, some people like science, some people like math. We have our own special interests. We, in the course of our lifetime, read different things. We listen to different things, so we have a different collection of material that we've collected in our head that helps us understand what we see in the world. Each of us is unique. We have unique ways of thinking, unique ways of seeing things. And 2,000 years ago, the rabbis recognized this, and they said, you know, God has to be able to communicate to each one of us in a way that each one of us can understand. And we may get something a little different than the next person understands. That allows for a lot of, in my opinion, individual thinking about the nature of God, God's relationship in the world, God's relation to each one of us. It's really a very powerful statement, and it comes from this idea that God spoke to each person at Sinai in a way they particularly could understand. And And so in terms of revelation, which is what the holiday celebrates, it says a very important thing about revelation, that each of us has our own way of understanding God. And so that's one idea. And the other thing I wanted to point out here was, we said there's 613 commandments, but even the text that tells us that, which comes from the Talmud, and again, that's based on gematria, which I won't go into right now, but you can read this and see how they get the number 613. So first of all, I would say my personal reading of this is that it's a clever idea, but don't take it too literally. There are hundreds of commandments. How we identify 613 is, we actually argue about that. So don't worry too much about the number. We just know there's hundreds of commandments. But even the text that points that out to us then says, let's reduce them to some simple principles. So David reduced them to 11 principles based on the idea that King David wrote all of the Psalms. So in one of the Psalms, they count 11 different principles, and here they are. And then Isaiah came and reduced them to 6 based on a verse in Isaiah that they count only 6 commandments. And then Micah comes and reduces them to 3, one of the famous statements from the prophet Micah, a brilliant statement about how to live a good life. He says 3 things. It has been told you, O mortal, what is good and what the Lord requires of you. Number 1, do justice. Number 2, love kindness. And number 3, walk humbly with God. If you do those 3 things, you're basically following the 613 commandments. That's what this amazing text in the Talmud says. Yeah, there's 613 commandments, but we can simplify it for you. Here's 3 things to remember. And then Isaiah, again, reduces them to 2 based on another verse from Isaiah. And finally, Amos says, you can reduce it to 1. Seek me and live, right? So, so even the text that says commandments said, but you can simplify it for people who don't have time to study and learn all the 613 commandments. The last thing in our handout, and then I'm going to quit over here. There's 2 things here, and then I'm going to quit. There's 2 different versions of the 10 Commandments, as you probably know. The first one is in Exodus, where it's first given, and then in Deuteronomy, where Moses repeats many of the stories and laws that happened earlier, and he repeats the 10 Commandments. The differences are indicated in this chart in the boldface type. The stuff in regular type is the same, virtually the same from Exodus, Deuteronomy, but the parts that are different are written in boldface type. The major difference you can see is the commandment about Shabbat. In Exodus, it's about God creating the heavens and the earth and resting on the 7th day. And in Deuteronomy, it's about God taking you out of slavery, and therefore everybody has to rest, including your servants, because it's a social justice thing. Here it's about creation, here it's about social justice. Those are the main differences in the 2 versions of Shabbat, except for the opening verb, which a lot of people make a big deal out of. It says, remember the Sabbath day in Exodus and observe the Sabbath day in Deuteronomy. The last thing is a little article by one of my Talmud teachers, Eliezer Diamond. It's a beautiful sort of his interpretation of the book of Ruth. I'll let you read that on your own. So that's kind of the handouts for today. Are there questions, anybody? Any questions? So thank you all for joining us again here after Passover. If you do have any questions later, feel free to email me or ask them. And I hope you had a good Passover. Like I said, this Wednesday I'll be talking about the book of Ruth. And stay tuned for what we're going to do for Shavuot. I hope we'll all stay safe and healthy. And we'll see you again next week, where we talk about the conversion process.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay.
Thank you,
Thank you all
Rabbi.
for joining us.
Bye.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Be safe.
Thank you too.